The porch light was still on when I finally understood my grandfather had known all along that his own daughter was stealing from him and that he'd been dying with that secret for months, waiting for someone he could trust enough to hand it to. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Elena, and before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I need you to understand what happened on the day I buried the only father I ever really had. It was a gray October morning in Franklin, Tennessee. I sat in the front pew of a small white church, my 6-year-old daughter Lucy's hand wrapped tightly around two of my fingers. She didn't fully understand why Grandpa Walt was inside that wooden box at the front of the room. She only understood that he wasn't going to read her bedtime stories anymore. And that kind of grief doesn't need explaining to a child. It just settles into them. Beside me, there were 2 empty seats. I kept glancing at them, foolishly, the way you glance at a door hoping someone will walk through it. Some small part of me still believed my parents would come rushing in, breathless, full of apologies, saying the flight had been delayed, saying they were so sorry, saying they would never actually miss this. I heard whispers around me. Where are Denise and Greg? I thought they'd at least come for their own father's funeral. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have one for myself either. The pastor stood to speak, and his voice cracked slightly as he said, "Walter always believed love isn't measured by words, it's measured by who shows up." That sentence landed somewhere deep in my chest and stayed there, because if that was true, and I believed with everything in me that it was, then my parents had just answered a question they never had to ask out loud. After the burial, I sat alone in my car in the church parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe normally. Mason, my husband, had taken Lucy for ice cream so I could fall apart in private. That's exactly what I was doing when my phone buzzed in my lap. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. It was a photograph. My mother and father standing on a white sand beach in Turks and Caicos, holding 2 drinks with little paper umbrellas, both smiling like they hadn't just missed burying my grandfather. The caption underneath read, "Living our best life." The timestamp told me everything I needed to know. It had been posted while the funeral service was still happening. Something inside me didn't just crack that day. It broke clean in half. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that photo, long enough that my hands went numb around the phone. And just when I thought I couldn't absorb one more shock, another notification appeared. Not Facebook this time, a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Elena, this is Samuel Pierce, Walter's attorney. He asked me to reach out after the service. Please come to the farmhouse today, as soon as you can. He asked that you come alone." I read it 3 times before it made sense. To understand why that message shook me so deeply, you have to understand who Walter was to me. Because he wasn't just my grandfather, he was the man who chose me when my own parents didn't. When I was 7 years old, my mother and father left me at his farmhouse with 1 pink suitcase and a promise. "Just a few weeks, sweetheart," my mother said, kissing my forehead. "We'll be back before you know it." They didn't come back. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. Walter became my father in every sense except biology. He showed up to every school concert, even the ones where I only had 2 lines in the chorus. He sat in the bleachers at every softball game, cheering loud enough to embarrass me in the best possible way. He bandaged my scraped knees and sat with me at the kitchen table through hours of algebra homework, patient even when I cried from frustration. When Tennessee thunderstorms rolled through and I was too afraid to sleep, he'd sit in the hallway outside my bedroom door, reading his newspaper under the hall light, just so I'd know I wasn't alone in the dark. He never called himself a hero. He never needed to. He simply showed up every single time, without fail, for 27 years. I grew up and built a career as a certified fraud examiner, which, looking back now, feels almost like fate found me early. I married Mason and we had Lucy, and Walter, who she called Grandpa Walt, became her favorite person in the entire world. His farmhouse became our family's safe place, the one spot on earth where nothing bad could reach us. Then his health began to fail. I spent nearly every evening after work at that farmhouse. I organized his medications into little labeled containers. I cooked his meals. I paid his bills when his hands started shaking too much to write checks steadily. I sat beside him in waiting rooms, holding his hand the way he used to hold mine. And then, out of nowhere, after years of near silence, my mother came back into his life. She said she wanted to help care for her father in his final months. Walter, being Walter, welcomed her with open arms, no questions asked, because he believed in second chances more than anyone I've ever known. But I started noticing things almost immediately. Mail disappeared before he had the chance to open it. Bank statements went missing from the kitchen counter where he always kept them. New paperwork would appear that he didn't remember signing, and when I gently asked him about it, he'd rub his temple and say, "I think I signed something, Elena, but I can't quite remember what." When I brought my concerns to my mother, she'd smile that same practiced smile she'd always used to smooth things over. "I'm his real daughter," she told me once, standing in his kitchen, flipping through his files like she owned them. "Let me handle this." "Mom," I said, "what is all this paperwork?" "Just helping Dad get organized," she said, without even looking up. "You worry too much." For Walter's sake, I stepped back. I told myself I was being paranoid, that family doesn't do this to family. I was wrong, and some part of me knew it even then. What I didn't know was that Walter had already figured out exactly what was happening. Quietly, without telling a single soul, he began documenting everything. He wrote notes after every bank visit, he kept copies of checks, he saved receipts in an old shoebox tucked in his closet. And near the end, when his body was failing, but his mind remained sharp as ever, he sat down in front of an old laptop camera and recorded a message. He never told me. He just seemed to know, somehow, that the truth would need somewhere to live after he was gone. Which is how I ended up walking up the porch steps of that farmhouse on the evening of his funeral, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Samuel Pierce was waiting inside, a tall, quiet man in his 60s with kind eyes and a folder tucked under his arm. "Elena," he said gently, "Walter left very specific instructions. No other relatives, just you." He led me into Walter's old workshop, where a wooden toolbox sat on the table between us. Inside, I found his handwritten journals, organized bank statements, check registers, property records, a small flash drive, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in his familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. Samuel inserted the flash drive into Walter's laptop, and a moment later, my grandfather's face filled the screen. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered him being, but his eyes were clear, focused, completely present, the same eyes that used to watch me from the bleachers at every softball game. "Elena," he said, "if you're watching this, it means I didn't get the chance to say it to you myself. I found out your mother's been taking money from me, slowly, carefully, in ways she thought I wouldn't notice. I tried talking to her about it privately. She told everyone I was just getting forgetful, confused. Maybe some of them believed her." He paused, and his voice softened into something almost like an apology. "If you're watching this, it means I couldn't stop them myself. I need you to finish what I started." I sat there and cried the way I hadn't cried since I was 7 years old, sitting on that same porch waiting for parents who weren't coming back for me. But underneath the grief, something else began rising, something steady, something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like purpose. I called Victoria Lawson, an elder law attorney known for being thorough and relentless. Together, we spent the following weeks reconstructing Walter's finances, piece by piece. What we found turned my stomach. My mother hadn't just taken a little here and there. She had built an entire system. False caregiver payments to herself, invoices for contractor work that was never done, duplicate medical reimbursements, and withdrawals moved carefully through several accounts to make them harder to trace. Because of my background investigating fraud, I recognized patterns most people would have missed entirely. But even I wasn't prepared for the final number. Nearly $500,000, taken slowly enough that no one outside the family would have noticed until it was far too late. Walter had documented almost every single dollar. The court date arrived on a cold morning at the Williamson County Courthouse. My mother walked in wearing a tailored blazer, chin lifted, looking entirely too confident for someone about to be confronted with the truth. Her attorney stood and argued that she had simply been managing her father's finances during a difficult illness, nothing more. Victoria didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She laid out the evidence, piece by piece, beginning with the vacation photo. Its timestamp proving beyond doubt that my mother had been standing on a beach, not stuck at some airport, while her own father was being lowered into the ground. Then came the journals. Then the financial records. Every forged invoice, every unauthorized transfer, every missing dollar laid bare in front of the judge, in front of my mother, in front of me. Finally, Victoria asked permission to play the recording. The courtroom went completely silent as Walter's face appeared on the screen. "If Denise tells you I wanted her to have everything," he said, calm and steady, "she's lying." No one moved. He explained in his own words exactly how he'd discovered what was happening, how he'd quietly kept records, because he feared that after he was gone, no one would believe an old man's word against his own daughters. When the recording ended, the silence stretched on long enough that it felt like the whole room had forgotten how to breathe. My mother rose slowly to her feet, and for the first time that day, her composure cracked completely. "I was his daughter," she said, her voice breaking apart. "Everything he owned should have been mine." It wasn't a shout of anger. It was something sadder than that, an admission spoken in grief and desperation that told the entire courtroom everything they needed to know. Beside her, I saw my father lower his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Later, outside the courthouse, he approached me quietly, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "I should have asked more questions," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I'm sorry, Elena. I really am." I didn't forgive him that day, but for the first time, I believed he meant it. The judge ordered my mother to repay every dollar that could be recovered and permanently removed her from any claim to Walter's estate. The case was referred for further investigation into elder financial exploitation. Several relatives later admitted, quietly and with visible shame, that they had noticed warning signs and said nothing at all. I didn't celebrate any of it. Justice, I've learned, doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being able to breathe again after holding your breath for months. Months later, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew me. Instead of keeping the farmhouse, I donated it to a nonprofit organization that provides housing and support for elderly people facing abandonment, illness, or financial hardship. With the funds we recovered, I established the Walter Brooks Neighbor Fund, which now helps seniors across our county cover groceries, prescriptions, transportation, and emergency home repairs. Walter spent his whole life quietly showing up for people. I wanted his kindness to keep showing up, even without him here to do it himself. One evening this past autumn, I drove out to the farmhouse with Mason and Lucy. The porch light had burned out, and something about that small detail hit me harder than I expected it to. As I climbed the steps to replace the bulb, Lucy looked up at me and asked, "Mom, why do you always make sure Grandpa's porch light stays on?" I knelt down beside her, feeling the same lump rise in my throat that always seemed to appear when I thought about him. "Because somewhere out there," I told her, "someone feels forgotten, and Grandpa taught me that a single light can remind them someone still cares." We drove away as the porch glowed warm and steady behind us, spilling gold light across the Tennessee hills the way it always had, the way it always would. I don't think about Walter as a man who left behind money or property. I think about him as a man who spent his entire life showing up when everyone else walked away. And I've come to believe that family was never about the name written on a birth certificate. It's about the people who leave the light on for you, even when you don't know yet that you'll need it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who simply showed up when it mattered most, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We share these stories because somewhere out there, someone needs the reminder that love, patience, and quiet loyalty are never wasted, even when they go unnoticed for years. And if you're carrying a burden tonight, wondering if honesty and patience are worth holding on to, let this be your reminder. The truth may take time to surface, but it always finds its way into the light. Stay steady, stay kind, and never stop showing up for the people who matter most. This story carries meaning far beyond its emotional moments. It sheds light on the very real and often overlooked issue of elder financial exploitation, a problem that affects countless families across the country, frequently at the hands of those closest to the victim. It reminds viewers how important it is to pay attention to changes in an aging loved one's finances, behavior, and paperwork, and it encourages open communication rather than silence whenever something feels wrong. It also speaks to a deeper truth, that family is defined not by blood, but by consistent love, presence, and sacrifice shown quietly over years rather than declared loudly in a single moment. Finally, it teaches that justice, when pursued through patience and integrity rather than anger, leads not to bitterness but to genuine healing, allowing both the living and the memory of those we've lost to finally find peace.